Are we countdown? We are live. Wow. Well, welcome everyone. Simon Bliss here, Chair of Team. Welcome to the first of the startup sessions with some brilliant partners that we've got here today. And thank you all for coming. So this session is about setting up your business confidently and compliantly, legally, and making sure you've got those pillars, those important pillars ready to go into market before you start selling, before you develop your brand and all of the other important things you have to do as a recruiter. I'm really pleased to say we've got our principal lawyers here today on force, Paul Chamberlain and Simon Block from JMW, who've been partners with Team now for decades now, isn't it, Paul?
It is, yeah, about 25 years, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for all the support you've given us in the past and your contribution today. And we've got another principal partner here from Marsh, Grant Barnfather. Thank you for joining us. You're our exclusive partner with regard to insurance and all things insurance, and absolutely key to setting up your recruitment business today. And finally, Stuart, who's been a bit of a revelation with the Team Network recently. You've been saving some of our members thousands of pounds in giving sensible accountancy and finance advice and making sure that they've got they're legal, but all the principles of tax, insurance, cash flow. It's been a real help. So I've got multiple thank yous in my inbox of referrals we've done to you. So great job. We're gonna kick off first. If you've got to set your business up legally. And you must also not necessarily think about tomorrow. You must think about longer term than that. So I'm going to invite Paul and Simon to kick off and making sure that when you're formalizing your company, your partnership, or your sole tradership, that you're thinking about things longer term rather than just trading tomorrow. So, Paul.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you. So you've decided you want to set up your own recruitment business. It's a big step, and there are certain things that you need to think about legally. And Simon and I will walk you through some of the main items. This is not designed to be an exclusive list by any stretch, but things that you need to have on your radar and things that you need to explore and consider before you press the button on trading. So you're going to set up, the first question you need to ask yourself is, are you going to operate as a sole trader, or are you going to operate in some other way or through some other vehicle? And broadly, there are three options available to you. You can operate as a sole trader, which will be John Smith trading as XY Recruitment. The issue with a sole trader arrangement is that all of the liabilities that you might incur within your business sit with you as a human being with any other entity. So if you were to get yourself into difficulties, let's say you were supplying a temporary worker and the temporary worker brought a claim, the claim would be against you personally. And Grant will be able to talk to you about insurance cover that might well be available in those circumstances. But the important point is to note, or the important point to note is that liability sits with you. And you may be uncomfortable with that from the get-go, or you may actually decide for the time being you'll operate in that way. But then the other two options that are available to you, almost three options really, might then become more relevant. So if you decided not to operate as a sole trader, you could operate as a traditional partnership. That would involve you having to be in partnership with someone else. Traditional partnerships now are very much not in fashion. The more appropriate partnership vehicle is what we call a limited liability partnership, an LLP, which is regulated by statute. This firm, for example, is a limited liability partnership. In traditional partnerships, the liability isn't limited. So if you were to enter into a traditional partnership with someone else, you would be jointly and severally liable for the company's liabilities and debts. In a limited liability partnership, your liability is limited effectively to the amount of capital that you introduce to the LLP. So it's a good way of limiting your exposure. So we've had sole trader, we've had partnership, traditional partnership, limited liability partnership, and then we get to the final model, which is probably the most obvious and the one that people consider and utilise the most, and that is the limited company model. So you would go to a company formation business, you would effectively buy an off-the-shelf company. That company would have a shareholder or shareholders, and you would utilise that vehicle as the vehicle through which you would trade. And limited companies, the word limited means something. It means that the liability that you have as an individual is limited to the shares that you have in that business. So you can see immediately why that is the most obvious and the most well utilised model. So those are your broad options in terms of setup vehicles. Let's focus a little bit then on the limited company vehicle. You can set up a limited company on your own where you are the only shareholder and you are the only director. But sometimes you may want to give shares to a co-investor, or you may want to give shares to family members. So it may well be that you end up in a situation where there are other shareholders as well. If you don't have a shareholders agreement in place between you and your other shareholders, then that can be a recipe for disaster. Everybody starts these enterprises thinking that the garden is rosy and there will never ever be any problems. And lo and behold, a few years down the line, there are problems, and the two founders decide that they don't want to work together anymore. And then when we ask them, when they come to us for advice, we say, have you got a shareholders agreement? The answer is no, we didn't even think about a shareholders agreement. And that leaves us in a rather difficult position, because anything to do with the shares, with the constitution of the business, all of that is then governed by the Articles of Association. And if you've used template articles or standard articles, sometimes they won't cover off the particular situations that you might be facing, and they may not be appropriately drafted to deal with those situations when they arise. So a couple of bits of advice: consider your articles when you incorporate and get someone with experience to look over them and advise as to whether or not they're fine in their standard form or whether they need to be amended in a bespoke way to cover off any issues that you might have. And if you're going to invite other people to take shares in the business, or you're going to gift shares to people, we would strongly recommend that you enter into a shareholders agreement, which will then regularise those arrangements and more particularly will deal with all eventualities if that relationship were ever to break down. So that's broadly it in terms of vehicles and things to watch out for if you're going to incorporate. The other thing you need to think about as well is if you are a statutory director but also an employee of the business, and if you have any other directors who are also employees of the business, it's going to be very important also for you to consider putting in place some service agreements. Now, again, we get clients who say to us, well, we don't really need service agreements. We're the best of mates. Everything's going to be fine. We understand each other. We know what we've agreed. And then lo and behold, in a year or two's time, when the relationship breaks down and you try and find out what was agreed, invariably there are no notes, there are no emails, there are just conversations. And it's very, very difficult then to try and unpick that relationship. And that just results in cost. Because if you can't unpick the relationship, you need lawyers and the courts to do it for you, and that's not a cheap exercise. So thinking ahead and getting a director service agreement in place is really sensible. If the relationship breaks down, the service agreement will regularise what happens on the breakdown of the relationship from an employment law perspective. And more importantly, as you move forwards and the business grows, it's possible to amend that service agreement to fit the new situation. And invariably, service agreements are amended as businesses grow. But as well as regularising the sort of remuneration arrangements and the termination arrangements, those service agreements also contain, or should contain, good, well-drafted restrictive covenants. Because if your business partner decides to leave after 12 months and takes all the business with them, if you haven't got a service agreement with restrictive covenants in it, then you are going to be in a prize pickle. And you could find that all of your business walks out of the front door with your ex-business partner. So service agreements are a very important item to consider. And that's all I wanted to say about formation, vehicles and documentation to protect your business. Just before I hand over to Simon, I'm just going to mention an area of compliance, because Simon's going to talk about some of the regulatory framework that you need to operate within if you're an employment agency or an employment business. I just wanted to talk specifically about the GLAA, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority. If you're going to be supplying workers in the agricultural and food processing sectors, then it's a statutory requirement that you obtain a gangmaster's licence. It's quite a tortuous process. It's quite an expensive process as well. But the important thing to note is if you are supplying into those sectors, you can't do so without a licence. And if you do so without a licence, you are committing a very serious criminal offence. So the other thing to bear in mind is that if you're going to supply into those sectors, but you're also going to use, for example, an umbrella company to help source the workers, the umbrella company also needs to have a gangmaster's licence. So you can have one. If you then fall for an umbrella that doesn't have one, then you are equally in difficulties. So it's very important you make sure the supply chain has a licence. I just wanted to say something very quickly about the GLAA. You'll have heard from commentary around the Employment Rights Bill that there is going to be something called a Fair Work Agency, which is going to be brought into existence. The functions of the GLAA, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority, will slot into the Fair Work Agency's remit, and they will effectively do everything that the GLAA currently do. So that's something to bear in mind. And the other and final thing to bear in mind before I hand over to Simon is to say that the conduct regulations, which Simon's going to talk a little bit about now, they don't apply to supplies into gangmaster licensed sectors. So if you're supplying solely into gangmaster licensed sectors, you don't have to worry about the conduct regulations, but you do have to worry about what are called the gangmasters licensing standards. They are broadly the same as the obligations under the conduct regulations, but they are slightly different. So again, we've got a lot of experience in that area. So if agriculture or food processing is something you are thinking of supplying temporary workers into, I'd suggest you take some advice from those who have got some experience. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Simon. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Paul. So I want to just talk about a couple of the regulatory requirements that you're going to be faced with if you're entering the recruitment sector. So the first one I want to talk about is the conduct regulations. So we previously had the Employment Agencies Act 1973, which still exists as a piece of legislation in terms of the governance of a recruitment business, but also, as Paul says, the conduct regulations, or to be known by its longer term, the Conduct of Employment Agencies and Employment Businesses Regulations 2003. So they date back 20 plus years and have taken on various forms over that time and have been amended over that time quite significantly. But just think about it in terms of how the conduct regulations work and how they govern the the operation of a recruitment business. People often refer to recruitment agencies, but the reality of it is that in terms of regulatory compliance, it's split down into really two sections. You've got an employment agency and an employment business. So an employment agency is engaged by its client, usually the hirer, to find individuals who are work seekers for employment by the hirer, and then the hirer enters into a contract directly with the individual, which may be a contract of employment or a contract for services. That's typically known as your permanent type of supply of services. So you're finding somebody to be engaged directly by your client. Then you've got an employment business who again engages with a work seeker, which is normally an individual, under either a contract for services or a contract of employment, and then supplies them to the client, to the hirer, for temporary assignments where they will be under the client's supervision or control. And that's typically known in the recruitment sector as a supply of temporary workers. So you will be operating as an employment business. And it's really important that you understand how you're operating and what type of supply that you're faced with, because that will depend on the rules that apply under the conduct regulations, which require you to agree certain terms with work seekers and things that you have to make sure that you put in place for the protection of the work seeker to ensure that you are compliant. Because the governance of the Employment Agencies Act and the conduct regulations is governed by the Employment Agency Standards Inspectorate, who do go out and they will check recruitment businesses' compliance with these rules, and they do have the power in the most extreme of circumstances to put conditions on it, how an employment agency, employment business operates, or in the worst case scenario, they do have the power to shut you down. It's not used very frequently, but the power is there. So you can see that complying with the conduct regulations is important. So getting compliant terms in place with your work seekers and getting compliant terms in place with your clients, your hirers, is important to make sure that there is a protection there. I think the only other point I really want to mention in relation to the conduct regulations is in relation to umbrella companies. It's been a long path coming, but it's looking like under the Employment Rights Bill that we are going to see umbrella companies come under the remit of the conduct regulations, which will be a huge and important change for the sector. So that is something really just to keep an eye out for. While just in terms of the agency workers regulation, so if you, there's a long history to the employment, to the agency workers regulations, which came out of the EU Temporary Workers Directive. But basically, the agency workers regulations apply to those who are assigned to do temporary work for hirers through a temporary work agency. And there is a definition of what a temporary work agency is. But basically what the agency workers regulations provide is that all agency workers must be able to access a hirer's collective facilities and amenities and have access to information about job vacancies from the first day of their assignment. And in addition, after the completion of a 12-week qualifying period, agency workers are entitled to the same basic working and employment conditions that they would have been entitled to had they been recruited by the hirer. So things like pay, things like working time, rest periods, and rest breaks, as well as annual leave. agency workers are entitled to parity after a 12-week qualifying period. That's an important step, that if you're supplying temporary labour, that you just need to make sure that you've got systems and processes in place to understand how you're going to work with your hirer, to understand how you're going to ensure that the workers receive that parity of treatment. And depending on who is responsible for the failure in the chain in terms of making sure that you get the information to be able to ensure that the parity is provided, will depend on whether the hirer is liable or whether the agency is liable. So it's going to be an important start of your communication process with your client to ensure that you're complying with your obligations. So that's just a whistle-stop tour of the two pieces of regulatory requirements that you're going to have to look at if you're new to this space.
Wow, you've frightened us all, Simon and Paul. But, just a couple of comments. Thank you for explaining all the different processes and ways of setting up, Paul. That was really valuable. And I think it was important to talk about shareholders' agreements, restricted covenants and service agreements. Since I took over team, having run my recruitment business back in the noughties through to 2020, and then taking over the team, I probably had a dozen discussions with business owners who hadn't set up a shareholder agreement or service agreement with their original business partner. And the whole thing has gone to pot.
Yeah.
And it's been a bloodbath, which has been exceptionally costly. It's broken the business up, and several of those businesses have ceased to trade because they didn't plan properly. I don't want to frighten you more, folks, but there's been 4,064 new limited companies in recruitment this year alone. So lots of people are setting up, and potentially they're not setting up. That's just the limited companies, not the sole traders. I think it's relevant, Paul, Simon, that you referred to the different types of recruitment business. The permanent recruitment businesses set up at Companies House under SIC code 78109. Make sure you register properly if you're going to do that. And the temporary businesses, which could be both, also you register for both, are set up with a SIC code 78200. So make sure you're doing that correctly. It's not very expensive to set up a limited company. You can do that online with Companies House for £50 and a credit or debit card. But Stuart, you might come in a bit later with a bit of advice on that. You're welcome to fire some questions in the chat for our legal panel now, and I'll flick those for the team a bit later on. Grant, I'm going to come to you next. So we've set up our business as a sole trader or an LLP or as a limited company. But already Paul and Simon have highlighted areas where people may want to invest in insurance. What is needed? What is absolutely needed for a new recruitment business to set up?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Simon. Really, really great insight from Paul and Simon there as well. It segues nicely into insurance, actually. So, I mean, look, from a starting perspective, there are legal requirements in and around businesses dependent on your needs, your size and scale of business, dependent on how you're starting out. Effectively, that comes in the shape of one element of cover, and that's employer's liability. So naturally, look, if you're employing anyone within the business from day one, you're going to need to have employer's liability by law. Effectively, that protects the business against claims made by employees who might get injured or fall ill due to their work within the organisation or business. Now, look, there are different elements in terms of that setup. So we talked about sole traders, partnerships, limited companies. You may see a limited company setup where maybe two directors have gone into a joint venture as not having employees. We're two directors, we set this business up together. Well, actually, from a standpoint, you're both employees of that business from day one. And effectively, you should have employer's liability in place to to ensure that, should one or the other become injured as a result of working in that organization, that they're able to make a claim as well. If you had an injury, you should look to do that. But look, beyond that legal constraint, there's so much more that you should consider as a day one insurance perspective. And luckily, insurance is generally packaged up. So if you speak to a broker, to be honest, if you're buying online, you'll generally be directed to the questions of cover that you should be looking to take out. What I mean by that is professional indemnity is something I would definitely be looking to take. Now, there are certain professions in the UK where professional indemnity is legally required. Recruitment is not one of those areas. But I would definitely recommend that. This covers you as an organisation against claims for mistakes or negligence in your professional services that you're going to be offering as part of your day-to-day services and solutions. And we can extend that cover to your placements as well. So effectively, we can expand that beyond the basic constraints of what professional indemnity can do. I'd also recommend public liability. Now, again, this is going to be packaged up in terms of what the capabilities are of most general insurance policies out there in the UK. But again, that's going to protect you from financial losses if someone is injured or their property is damaged due to your business activities. The three types of insurance cover that cover the basics that most recruitments need effectively are those three things. However, look, there's so much more that you should be looking at. And I always sort of would advise any startup or any business actually year on year in terms of our advice and engagement. At the end of the day, you are insuring your livelihood here. Now, insurance is always seen as a transaction and a last minute piece, but actually education and advice of a good broker that sits in and around what good service should look like should be advising you of those risks that sit in and around your business. And that's going to change year to year. Actually, probably going to change month to month. And again, you should be able to have that advice line into your broker, regardless of your renewal coming up or having a midterm engagement. You should be able to call them daily. That's a personal relationship and a service that you've paid throughout the year, where you should be able to source advice around contracts that you're entering into and additional insurance requirements you might have. So look, a couple of other things to point out that I definitely recommend. Cyber liability insurance. We'll come on to that in a second, but the threat of cyber is definitely on the rise. It continues to do so. And look, that British mentality of it will never happen to me is starting to become a lot more frequent in terms of engagement that we have in terms of claims, advice requirements, and just general conversations across all sectors and all sizes of business. Management liability insurance, which includes directors and officers cover. Again, I'd recommend that dependent on the structure of your business and what that might look like. And beyond that, look, legal expenses, property and contents insurance, potentially driver's negligence as well, dependent on, again, what the scale of your business looks like. But all things that I think are super important. From a Marsh perspective, if you are engaging with us, we're looking at ring-fenced individuals that understand the sector and will advise you on your needs as a business. Of course, there are some non-negotiables that I've just mentioned that you should consider, but we'll always point out where there might be gaps in terms of cover requirements.
Thank you, Grant. I'm going to bring in Mike Nolan's question in a second. I'm just going to give a couple of examples. So people might not think of cyber liability immediately and think, well, I'm just starting up. I've got 3 clients. I've got 50 candidates. What's my risk? But we've seen, we've done some sessions. Stuart, you were at a couple of meetings where we've had some brilliant advice by Francis, our cyber security expert, on hackers are getting into CRM systems with recruitment companies, not necessarily for your individual to hack your business. They're trying to grab the data that is with your candidates and your clients and access client databases as well. And that could expose you to significant claims, A, with your client, be with your candidates and see with the I can't even remember the name of the organisation that can fine you 6 figures for having data in the marketplace. But so we've seen several recruitment businesses within the team network suffer cyber attacks. It's closed some businesses and it's cost other businesses in excess of hundreds of thousands of pounds. So just have those conversations. I'm going to come on to Mike Lohner's question in a minute, but just as a slight big up for Marsh, some fantastic feedback recently about you guys, Grant. You're giving all of our members, existing and new, 10% discount on your rates. Those people that are moving in from incumbents from we've seen up to 50% saving with your products and services to our members from several of our members in our very busy WhatsApp web chats. So thank you for the great work your teams are doing. Reducing costs for our members is significant. I mean, we're a revenue business, but the cost elements are vital. That brings me on in a second to Stuart. But Mike Nolan's asked a really interesting question. You probably saw that. If your business does perm only and the 2 directors are not classed as employee, they may be not taking a salary, but just taking it at the end of it. Is it a legal requirement to have that employer's liability? And I might throw that open to our legal panel as well.
Yeah,
so,
good question. I think, look, if you're doing permanent only, I think if you're working in an organisation and there's an element of risk there, I'd be seeking to get employers' liability insurance, just for that certainty. Effectively, it could be one single person that's responsible for health and safety in the organisation. As the guys mentioned earlier, you could be in a position where there's a fallout for whatever reason. That could be over an incident at work, and naturally, look, that mentality of I wouldn't look to make a claim could change overnight based on the circumstances of the incident that occurs.
Okay, that's cool. The other thing I would warn people of is lots of recruitment businesses start up as a solopreneur, and they do that for a year, maybe longer, and then they will look to expand. And they've forgotten about employers' liability because they've been on their own as a solo. If you're starting to employ and build your teams, this is something extremely mindful to think about, because it's illegal to not operate with employers' liability if you're starting to build your teams. Anything you want to add, Paul or Simon?
I was only going to very briefly mention, Simon, that very often people say, well, I'm not an employee because I'm just taking a dividend.
Yeah.
Because the legal test is slightly different. So even though you've decided just to take a dividend, that doesn't mean you're not an employee. So I think I'm with Grant on this. I think if there's a doubt or a question mark, it's probably better to make sure you've got the insurance in place than not.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And you used a few acronyms earlier, AWR, IR35 and ERB. I think it's fair to say, Paul and Simon, you're doing quite a bit more work. The ERB and the umbrella changes are going to change the way recruitment businesses operate in the UK. You're going to give us a couple of webinars coming up, aren't you, with a bit more guidance and direction on that? Yeah,
there's a lot of detail there, Simon, and you're right. We've dedicated a couple of sessions to that.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
We'll promote this to the community that are here today. Mike, I hope that's answered your question for you. It'd be worth having a chat with Grant and his team just to discuss your exact situation and make sure you are compliant and legal. Stuart, last but not least, it's great to invite you. Thank you for supporting us today. Now we've set up the company. We've got ourselves legal with our insurance. What are the other pillars that one wants to put in place before we start trading?
I just want to go first on the shareholding side. I know obviously that Paul and Simon have mentioned it, but when you look at the shareholding of your business, one of the things I would look at as well is if you're two people within a company, or if there's multiple shareholders within a company, look at the class of the shares. So if you are two people, then one person maybe has A class shares and the second person has B class shares. The reason for that is if you were decided at any point to allocate dividends in a different way. So if you decided one person was going to be taking £20,000 worth of dividends and the other person takes £10,000 worth of dividends, you can actually do that based on the fact that you're allocating different amounts of dividends to different share classes. If the business makes, say, £30,000 and you both have the same class of share, it would then mean if you were distributing £30,000, you both have to take 15,000. You can't, it has to be an equal split in the respect of, obviously, based on that share class. Whereas if you have different share classes, you can actually allocate different dividends to those different share classes. The other thing as well is about, obviously, if you put spouses on. So if you were to put your wife or your husband on, to obviously distribute dividends, you can do that as well, to use up their tax allowances, obviously, within the business as well. And again, I would then look to do that under a different share class as well, which obviously then would potentially have different rights on that one. The next thing I was going to talk about was HMRC. Obviously, unfortunately, death and taxes are the two, defilements in this world. Taxes. If you're registering as a limited company, you'll automatically be registered for corporation tax. So corporation tax is tax on your profits after overheads, and it's you have to pay corporation tax before you can take a dividend. Corporation tax is paid 9 months after the year end. So whenever you are making placements and you're doing your accounts, please make sure obviously that you account for that corporation tax. The next tax I would make sure you definitely, as a recruitment business, are registered for is VAT. So me and Simon have done quite a lot of work with team members on this. VAT, you as a business should be VAT registered, because if you're not VAT registered, you're telling your clients that you're under maybe £90,000 turnover, so you're making yourself look small. It's a cash flow issue. It's not a cost to your business. And also you can reclaim the VAT on your costs as well. So obviously if you're paying out for such as team membership or if JMW send you an invoice, then obviously quite often that'll have VAT on it. You can reclaim that VAT on your invoices as well. And the last tax to potentially look at as well is PAYE as well, because as employees, you obviously want to be taking a salary from your business, obviously, or if you're paying staff members, then you'll need to be registered for PAYE. So getting registered with HMRC is important, making sure you're obviously getting those registrations in, and then obviously keeping up with the compliance relating to those as well. The other thing you're going to need as a business as well is a business bank account. Obviously, there's lots of different types. There's high street banks, there's online banks. What I would suggest with the bank account is you can have multiple bank accounts. So you don't just have to have one bank account with one bank. You can have multiple bank accounts with different banks if you need to. The other thing as well I would look at as well is maybe have a savings account. So most business bank accounts don't have interest associated with them. So they're not interest-bearing accounts. Whereas if you actually had I know like with NatWest, for example, they have what's known as a business reserve account. And so what I would do is use that bank account to potentially put your taxes to one side. So if you're a perm business and you raise an invoice for £10,000 plus VAT, there's £2,000 worth of VAT on that invoice. When you get paid that £12,000, put the £2,000 into that bank account. It then means that when you come around for doing your VAT return, all of the money that you pay over to HMRC will be put to one side. You might also want to start putting corporation tax in there as well, because again, as I said, you're paying corporation tax 9 months after the year end. So it's something that you might not necessarily remember that you've got to pay. You're spending all the money in your bank account, and then suddenly this bill comes along that you're going to have to pay. So if you can put some extra money in that bank account as well, again, as I said, it's interest bearing. So you're going to make a little bit of money on that money that you're putting to one side that actually will go to HMRC. The other way to look at your business as well is you've got to see how you're going to pay yourself. So it's a case of paying yourself as a director. Now, what I'm going to tell you here is something that as directors of your business you can do. You can pay yourself a small salary and take the remainder as dividends. It's probably the most tax efficient way to pay yourself. So you potentially look at paying yourself maybe a £12,570 salary. You then pay a little bit of national insurance, which obviously the national insurance then means you've got your stamp for when you retire, and hopefully there's an available pension. And then you take the remainder as dividends. Dividends are more tax efficient in the lower levels, because you're up to the £50,570 bracket, you're only going to be paying dividend tax at 8.75%. So that's obviously a lot lower than obviously if you were being paid PAYE. There's no employees' national insurance or employers' national insurance on that as well. So it's a more tax efficient way of paying yourself. After that bracket, after the 50,570, the next bracket is you paying dividend tax at 33.75%. So again, that's much lower than the 40% bracket that you'd be paying under PAYE. And also you pay no employees' national insurance or employers' national insurance on there as well. So both of those are great ways of making sure you're paying yourself. This is something that the government have introduced to try and incentivize people to set up the business. People setting up businesses, and hopefully that will bring down the unemployment rate, because you're hopefully going to be employing people, and obviously it gives that kind of added benefit for directors. You do have to obviously take some get your accountant to make sure that is the best way to pay yourself, because obviously outside influences, other businesses, other income you might have an effect on that. Plus as well, there is certain times when you get to certain levels on dividends that actually it might be better to actually take a larger salary. But in the early days, look at the possibility of taking a small salary and dividends. The other thing I wanted to mention as well is about expenses. As we've said before today, you are an employee of your business. When you used to work for a recruitment agency and you were told to go out and maybe go and see a client, you would drive to the client, you'd take them for lunch, you'd come back to the office and you'd put an expense claim into the business, and you would then claim those expenses. It works exactly the same way with your own business. So what I'm saying here is if you're incurring expenses for your business, which is actually in the production of you actually doing the recruitment work, then you should be putting those expenses through the business. They are allowable expenses. So you should be putting things like a mileage login on a monthly basis and claim the 45p a mile for claiming on your mileage. You've also got things like subsistence, entertainment, along with all the other costs that go along with your business as well. But you just have to think about it from a perspective of, if you are spending money on your business, it's allowable to be reclaimed as a business. There are obviously rules that you have to follow, but it is more a case of just making sure you're not spending your own personal money on the business and not claiming it back. It's a case of it's a cost to your business that will reduce your corporation tax, except for entertainment. You might be able to also reclaim the VAT as well, but it's actually making the business work for you in some respect. You're working heavily in the business, so actually the costs incurred on those businesses should actually be going through the business. And that brings me on to the last point, which is all about accounting. You should actually be looking at an accountant, making sure you're getting a good accountant. I always say, preferable to get one who understands the recruitment industry. Maybe not necessarily the one that does the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. You want to get the one who's actually recruitment specific. You want to make sure that they're giving you that help and advice from a recruitment perspective. And I've had horror stories of recruitment agencies who are doing contractor placements, didn't do their quarterly intermediary reporting, and then all of a sudden they get found out that they didn't do their intermediary reporting, and it was because their accountant didn't specifically tell them anything about it because they weren't in the recruitment industry. So getting a recruitment specific accountant is a really good idea. And then also getting some kind of outsource your back office. In some ways, what you've got to do is make sure you're concentrating on running your business, get the experts to do the bookkeeping, get the experts to actually make sure that your books and records are kept in working order, because you don't want to fall foul of not supplying the correct details on your VAT returns, not doing your payroll correctly, not submitting your year-end accounts correctly as well. So if I was you, I would be looking at maybe getting some kind of management reporting, maybe quarterly management accounts, so that you actually know how your business is doing. You have an indication of your HMRC liabilities, and making sure obviously your business is making profit as well, so that you can take those all important dividends.
A question, Stuart. If I'm a solopreneur, I've just started my recruitment business, I'm working from home. What sort of costs can I apply for my home office?
Well, HMRC say, unfortunately, that it used to be in the past, there was accountants that would turn around and say, right, you could measure up your office and you could take a portion of your mortgage because you can take a portion of your gas and electric and all the rest of it. HMRC have kind of sort of changed that a little bit now. It's now £26 a month that you can reclaim as a home office for your business. So that is because it's the difference between your gas, electric, and your broadband when you're actually at home to when you're not at home. So it is £26 a month. But again, you would put that as a claim into your own business and get that £26 back to yourself. So that's £312 a year that goes as a cost to your business, but you get the actual benefit of that, which will then go back towards your gas, electric, water, and things like that.
So if I upgrade my Wi-Fi, because I'm going to be using Teams, CRM, I'm going to have LinkedIn open all the time. What about that? That might cost.
That comes within that £26, unfortunately. So yeah, it's just the difference that they because HMRC say that you would still probably have your broadband at home, you'd still have your gas and electric, even if you weren't working at home or you didn't have a home office. So it's a case of it's just to actually give you that kind of little bit of money back for the difference between obviously when you are working from home and not working from home.
Cool, I get that. All right, thank you for that. Michael P, you've come in with another question, which I'm going to throw back at probably Paul. That legal definition, and this has come up a couple of times with some of the food manufacturing recruiters that we've got in team, and I know you've advised members in the past with regard to that. Do they fall within the GLAA or not? That's the question.
Yeah, so there's an act that sets out which sectors are covered, and then there is some guidance. And it's fair to say that the act and the guidance are not particularly clear. So there have been some disputes in the past as to whether or not someone is within GLAA jurisdiction or not. What we have done before is we've effectively made an anonymous inquiry of the GLAA without naming the client. We've described the business if we're not clear on the definitions, and we've got them to give us a view. But again, if there's doubt, it's probably better to think about making an application rather than running the risk of them being found as someone working in those sectors and committing a criminal offence.
Thank you for that. That's been excellent. I'm just going to go back, Stuart. Stuart, you've done some audit. You do free audits for a few team members, haven't you? And I think for the startups and solos, I was surprised that your audits have uncovered. I think the saving was it 8,300 a year for each of those?
On average. Yeah, on average, it's about an £8,300 per client. So I've had the largest saving I've made so far has been £55,000 a year. Okay. But yeah, it's a case of looking at company recruiters are fantastic at recruiting, but numbers is not always their forte. And so what I try and do, hopefully, is kind of give it in English so that you can actually get the understanding of what you can and can't do through your business. But yeah, it's a case of it's been great. And yeah, I've done something like 25 free 2-hour sessions to team members this year, and it's been really good for those members.
Well, yeah, you've paid their team fees of startups only pay £65 a month, but that's paid for those fees many times over. So I really appreciate that. If there's any more questions, Jahisha, fire them into us. But anything from Paul and Simon of any advice or war story or last point you want to make for a startup thinking about what is going into a fairly challenging market across the board at the moment? Any tips or guidance to do or not to do? You're muted, so just be careful of that one.
Well, what I'd say, I think, is the rights bill, which I know we've not really touched on today. That is going to be a seismic change for all employers and employees, but particularly for recruiters around the use of zero-hours contracts. So we've got the framework for that at the moment, but we haven't really got a lot of the detail, which is unfortunate. We'd like to have some clarity, but but we really don't. But with team and with the webinars that we're going to provide, we hopefully give a little bit more clarity. If you're going to be operating in the temporary space, then you will need to be absolutely au fait with the Employment Rights Bill. So I would say that's the biggest word of warning or the word of caution moving forward.
No, thank you for that. And yes, those changes are coming down the track, aren't they? Those have been clarified probably in the next few months, but implementation will be next year, won't it?
We didn't get royal assent before the summer recess.
Yeah.
But with all big bills these days, there tends to be a sort of staged implementation over a period of time. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Paul and Simon. Grant, any final? Have you got a war story or any lasting principle or guidance you want to leave for startups today?
Yeah, I guess just as a not quite a war story, but something an article I was looking at the other week around sort of the cyber piece and the threat and how that's growing. For a 12-month reported period between 2023 and 24, over 50% of UK businesses, regardless of size or scale, experienced some form of security breach or attack. Now, I guess, look, as a startup, there's an element of looking at that and saying, okay, why would they bother with me? I'm going to hold less data. But then on the flip side of that, you may be looked at as the vulnerable opportunity and someone to attack. And I guess putting that back into perspective, got an example of where we did work with an existing client who had a cyber attack in the recruitment space. So 2 days before Christmas, as you can imagine, most businesses are sort of shutting down for the festive period. And client, 6 p.m, 23rd of December, gets a ransom demand through on email. Effectively, data that they hold on personal data has been secured. Now, look, most organisations are shut down at that point, but the good news is insurance doesn't sleep, and it's sort of a 24/7 response team that sits in and around the cover that we offer. So look, the team that we've got here stepped in immediately. Cyber security experts quickly working on how can we close this down, how do we negotiate with the ransom individual, and look, how do we manage the situation and take the pressure off the individual. Now, in this instance, this is a customer that didn't hold cyber cover prior to that year. So effectively, they'd been at risk. Luckily, they'd taken the cover out on the back of some education and advice we'd given them that year. And look, not all stories around the cyber incidents, come to a good result. And in terms of the negotiation piece, the insurer was actually unsuccessful with the ransomer. But what the insurer did in the policy that was in place to secure the coverage, the insurer paid out over £100,000 to support all of that sort of re-engagement and support. So, I mean, look, cyber insurance is definitely a nice to have. It can deter some people in terms of it's an additional cost. It won't happen to me. But there's a perfect example of why it should be taken. And look, I guess another important thing is insurance is in a soft market at the moment. So people are saving money on premiums. What a great time to sort of utilise that saving to take out that extra cover and protect yourself.
Yeah, I've seen actually lots of companies are asking about what cybersecurity you have in place and do you have insurance in place, because they're looking at their supply chains who might hold data from their clients. They're submitting, candidates into clients. They're working with companies closely, and companies want to know what cybersecurity and insurance you have in their supply chain. So they're asking those questions of recruitment businesses. So think about what you have on offer as you develop your service and operation. Stuart, anything to add before we close? We've got 6 minutes, so there we go.
Just one of the things I would say is, as a recruitment agency, just concentrate on doing the recruitment side. So look at outsourcing absolutely as much as you possibly can. So look at outsourcing your back office, look at outsourcing your accounts, look at outsourcing your IT, your marketing. Don't start being a director who's a bit of a busy fool and actually putting all these different hats on. Use the expertise of all of the different people you can. There's lots and lots of people in this, lots of suppliers to the recruitment industry that can actually take a lot of that pressure off you, and you concentrate on just making those all important placements. So that's the most important thing I would say is don't start looking at doing your own bookkeeping. Don't start looking at doing your invoicing, outsource it. Don't start doing your own IT setup, get it set up correctly. You know, I'm pretty sure Grant would agree here that basically your cybersecurity policy isn't worthwhile if you don't actually have the antivirus and it all set up correctly in the first place. So it's those kind of things, making sure it's all done correctly by using expertise outside of using experts who can actually do that for you. The other point as well I was going to say was about funding. If you are doing contractors, then you look at your funding. Don't start kind of going down the route of potentially funding it yourself, because quite often I find agencies who fund their own placements, they forget about things like credit insurance. So if that client that they're dealing with goes bust, then they're going to be on the hook for all the money that they put into it. If you use a funding provider, so you might use a pay and bill provider, so within the team network, there's the likes of, recruitment funding solutions, back office support services, Giant Finance Plus. They do a pay and bill solution where they'll raise invoices for you, they'll process the timesheets, raise invoices, pay the candidates, and give you the profit. And they will often provide kind of credit insurance or kind of insurances to obviously protect you should those clients go bust. If when you get to a larger size, then there's looking at invoice finance. So that's going to be factoring, invoice discounting facilities. And again, it's a case of that those will often be protected by kind of bad debt protection policies or credit insurance to actually make sure that you as a business are not having to pay out that money to pay the candidates before the client makes payment, but are also covering you should those clients go bust or obviously just not pay you. So those are the other two things I would say for a startup.
That's brilliant stuff. Thank you, Stuart. We've got, this is the first of the Launchpad, the Recruiters Launchpad series. We've got some more coming. Chahisha will help me out now. So session 2 is running on June the 20th. This is exciting, folks. This is about getting some new revenue in the business. As a startup, it's tough. You might be under a restricted covenant. So it's about job sharing, which is a slightly weird concept for a lot of recruiters who have not collaborated before. But we've got Claire Hallett-Walsh and Matt Richards, who are established team members. Claire's been a member for many years and has shared hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of jobs with other members where she's had the job but not the candidate, and vice versa. Matt Richards joined from Blueberry Recruitment last year. He's been a member for about 9 months now. He shared £50,000 worth of fees on jobs that probably wouldn't have got filled, that he's been able to match up candidates for, and some of his jobs for other members. And we've got the legend, Jeremy Snell, talking about driving sales in your pipeline. Jeremy, ex-Hayes trainer, and one of the UK's most prolific and successful learning and development trainers in the recruitment space. So jumping through to session 3, which is so this is about cost. One of the biggest costs you guys and girls will have when you start your business up will be job boards. You've got to find candidates for those jobs that you're getting on. The great news is, with Michelle Davis as a partner to team at Candidate Source, we can buy job boards at 70% of the discount. And here's the exciting piece. You don't have to sign a year contract anymore. You can pay as you go on a monthly basis and try different job boards, whether it be CV Library, Read, Total, Indeed, etc. So certainly catch that session. And also Luke Pitkin, a partner of team, has a free CRM, which is great for startups. CRM costs, as many of you will know, can be over £100 a month per user. So if you can kick off with a free CRM from Gig Hire, that significantly reduces your cost. And of course, at a later stage, as revenues build, you can develop and invest in something a bit more sophisticated. Session 4, if you can move us on, is how to build your brand. Now, you've got a personal brand if you're all recruiters on LinkedIn, but you've got to build your business brand. And that is significantly different. So we got Rob Woodford from the Marketing Junction, and we got those amazing guys from Pager the founder and CEO, Darren Westall, talking about how you can develop your business brand and personal brand in that session. And I think finally, if we can move on to the next session, Chris O'Connell from Base Mindset, XS3, brilliant consultant. I think he was one of their top billers and first one to bill £1 million. He's talking about setting up your business, your 90-day power plan, but also setting up your plan for the first year. So you've launched your business from the good guidance you've had from the people you had today. You've got things going, but really think about where you want to take the business over the first year. And he's giving you some real direction, focus, and process for getting you there. So I think that's it. I think we're done. It just leaves me to thank all of the partners that joined us today. Paul and Simon, thank you for your continuing support to all of our members, for the great advice you give. Grant, thank you and your team at Marsh for the significant savings you're giving our new members and people that are looking to renew their insurance now from incumbents that are not Marsh. And Stuart, keep up that great work with your free audits, because you're saving many of our members thousands every single year. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, all the attendees. Have a good day. See you again soon. Bye for now.